Hi everyone, welcome back to class. Just getting things ready here. We got about 3 minutes until class time. Hey Gary, good to see you. So I hope everyone's doing really well, having a good week. And we're just going to continue through our notes. We've got a little bit more on this time topic, and then we'll try to transition, if we can, into the philosophy of mind material today. So that's our goal. Hi guys, hi Haley, Rachel, hey Soul. Hey Ronald. Hope you guys are doing good. Okay, hey Jose, and hi there Carl. Hey Cameron. It's the funniest thing ever. I don't even know why I'm saying this, but it's funny. Like last night, or in the middle of the night, and then into the today, I have this TikTok video that's like all of a sudden getting so many views. It's crazy, like 18,000 views, and like I've just got 1,000 followers, like out of nowhere. Like, it's kind of funny because I never get any real like traffic on social media stuff, but that today it's just been kind of making me laugh. Every time I look back, I'm getting like more followers. It's weird. Internet's strange. I don't know. Maybe these are bots. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'll let you guys know how it continues, but yeah, it's just weird. Every time I look back, there's like it's just constant stream of people adding me. I don't know though. I think there must be some spam or fake accounts. What is my favorite philosopher? Well, to be honest, I really like the guy that we're going to talk about today quite a bit. That's David Lewis. But he's a little bit more of a modern figure, so he's not as well known to everybody. I guess going back in time, I don't know. I've always been a fan of a guy named Leibniz. He's an early modern philosopher. He talked about possible worlds and possibility and necessity, something I'm interested in a lot. I like Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I'm also a big fan of Gottlob Frege. So these are some important figures of the 19th and 20th century. Anyway, guys, welcome back. It's 5:30 now. Good to see everybody here. So let me just go ahead and get things started. First of all, I sent the essay prompts. Have you guys noticed that? The announcement that I delivered this week? Can anybody give me a confirmation that that's out there? Okay, good. So there's essay prompts that I've distributed. They're not due for a while. The second essay, if you look at the calendar on the syllabus, you see that it's due Tuesday, the 8th of December. And that's quite a ways out because we have Thanksgiving holiday week. So, that's, I don't even know, 18 days from now is the 30th, and then another 8. So almost 4 weeks, 3 weeks from Tuesday next week. So, no rush, but there's 3 topics that you could choose from. One of them is the philosophy of time that we're kind of finishing with now. Another topic is epistemology, the theory of knowledge stuff. And then another subject is the one that we're going to start working on today, and and then into next week, and that's the philosophy of mind. So anybody who's thinking of doing the philosophy of mind topic, I would just advise that maybe you wait a little bit to get some of those lectures under your belt, because the material, the content that's used for that topic is something that we're not yet into, and we're going to be pretty much done with most of it by the end of next week. So since you have plenty of time to develop the essay, and you probably only really would need like a week or two at the most to do it, it's fine if you want to wait a little while longer, and then you can start drafting your paper if you wanted to work on that topic. If you wanted to work on the epistemology topic, that's already behind us. If you want to do the philosophy of mind subject, that'll be pretty much done today. So I want to come back to the discussion of the paper prompts and stuff, but since we have a lot of time to continue to work on it until it's due, I wanted to first just get through the rest of the material on time right now so that we can kind of be caught up as much as possible. And then on Tuesday, if we didn't get any time to talk about it today, I'll give you some brief pointers and pieces of advice for writing that essay, but it's not really much different than the first essay, at least in terms of what I said back then. Okay, so today we cap off this discussion of time by looking at the writing of David Lewis. Okay, so David Lewis lived from 1941 until 2001. And I believe he's one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, really. He's written on so much interesting, weird stuff on all topics in the field, whether it's philosophy of language, logic, metaphysics, epistemology. So I really like his work. He's known for sometimes taking unconventional positions in philosophy, but giving like very, very good, clear defenses of them. Yeah, Cameron, monism and dualism, not yet. We have not yet talked about it. That's all I was mentioning just now. So that's something that is going to follow right after we finish with this time subject. So we'll get it in starting today and then throughout next week. Okay, yeah, but back to Lewis. He lived for 60 years. He's a great philosopher of the 20th century. He taught at UCLA for a while, at Princeton, and at some institutions in Australia. I guess even though he's an American, he really loved Australian culture. And so he spent some time there too. In 1971, he wrote this paper that we're going to now study. So he was a pretty young philosopher at the time. He gave it as a talk to a conference in 1971, and then 5 years later, in 1976, he published this in a journal. But since the original date was 1971, I'll just use that date. And it's called The Paradoxes of Time Travel. Okay, so it's The Paradoxes of Time Travel by David Lewis, great, recently deceased American philosopher. Opening my book there. And, you know, we've covered a little bit of material on time so far, obviously. We started just by looking at Einstein and learning about how the theory of relativity has these really interesting, deep implications for how we should consider space and time in this universe. So the relativity of simultaneity is kind of where we started. If you suppose there's two lightning strikes and then we say they're simultaneous, what's the definition of simultaneous? What Einstein says is, let's create an experiment that could test this proposition. So place an observer middle between A and B, assume that the speed of light is always constant, and if those two things are assumed as givens, then if the person sees the two light signals in one and the same visual perception, then we could deduce that they were emitted from their origins at the same time. But if you had a second observer passing through the scene in a train that's got velocity, and they pass through the midpoint while the other individual is doing their observation, then the second observer who's in motion will not see them simultaneously, given the fact that he's sliding over closer towards B, further from A. So the order of events in space-time is basically not objective, it's relative. And that means that, you know, you would have to then say that events which relative to you are considered to be future events that are not yet existent could also be seen as past events relative to another possible observer's condition. So that means that we just have to sort of suppose that all the events are just out there and that they're all equally real. Very weird idea. We also expanded on this by talking about the twins paradox and time dilation. And then last lecture, we mostly covered Ted Sider. Ted Sider just wants to explore what are some of the puzzling, weird paradoxes. Well, I don't know if I should say paradoxes, but some of the puzzling and strange aspects of time. One thing that he says is hard to explain or understand is how time is said to move. Everyday people say time moves, time flies, time is marching on, it's passing. But Explaining how it is that time moves is no easy task, because any attempt to do that runs up against circular definition. Because what it means for something to move in the first place is simply to be in different places at different times. So if time moves, what are we saying? That it's moving by being in different places at different times? Then we're using time to define its own motion. Maybe the present moment is what moves. He tried that one, but that, he also says, leads us into a circular definition. Because if the present moment is changing its position with respect to some kind of time, and now we have to ask how that second order time is structured and organized, which pushes us towards an infinite regress. So he thinks the best explanation to get around this problem is to simply affirm that time doesn't move at all. It simply sits there with space. Space-time includes all the events, and therefore there's no need to explain the movement of time because it simply doesn't happen. But if we accept that view, then we have to reorient our understanding of objects according to the theory. So that was when we started talking about the space-time diagrams, where there's a temporal dimension, and on that graph you show the existence of an object not just in space but also as it endures through time. A single moment in the timeline of an object is called one of its temporal parts. And according to the space-time theory, you and me and everything that exists is a set of spatial and temporal parts. So at each moment that you exist, there's one of your temporal parts there. And what you are in total is the aggregate sum of all the temporal parts along the timeline, taken as a unit. So you never fully experience the whole thing at a single moment. And I guess according to this view, you're not even fully present in your seat right now, but just some of your temporal parts that endure throughout the length of time for this lecture. Okay, and we closed the discussion of Sider by talking about what he calls three similarities between space and time, in terms of reality, in terms of parts, and in terms of the words here and now. And so you can go back to the lecture and see the discussion of those three similarities, but basically the reality similarity is that objects that are far away or close up in space, they're just as real, regardless of how far or close. And the same is true of time. Moments, events in time are just as real, whether they're happening now or whether they're happening way out in the future or the past. They're all just as real, not just, there's no difference between the present and the past and future. They're just as real as each other. It's not only the present moment that exists. The second similarity in terms of parts, objects take up space by having spatial parts, but they take up time by having temporal parts. And the third thing is that the words here and now are both relative terms. Here is a space word, now is a time word, but they both don't have an objective meaning. The meaning of it depends on where the person says the word here or when the person says the word now. Okay, so talked about some objections to the idea, but that'll kind of lead us into a segue into today's meeting. So here's David Lewis now, the last author on this interesting subject of time. And what he says, here is his thesis he's defending in the paper. In a way, it's a clear, straightforward argument. He's just trying to argue that time travel is possible. It is possible, is what he's saying. It's not impossible. So what he's trying to do is defend the concept of time travel against any suggestion that it's totally impossible and it's just a paradox. He knows that some people, if they think about the concept of time travel, they would come to a different conclusion. They would conclude that this is just something that could never happen. The idea of it itself involves logical contradictions and absurdities. But Lewis says, no, it's not absurd. It's not contradictory. Maybe it's a little weird to think about it, but it's not something that is actually completely impossible. So his goal in the paper is just to make that case, that time travel is possible, and he thinks he needs to like debunk all the claims that one might make about how it is impossible. So he's trying to set aside and explain away what some call paradoxes of time travel. He wants to show that these paradoxes do not actually establish that this is not possible. Okay, so we have to then take a little tour through some of his arguments and discussions here, and what are the paradoxes of time travel that he thinks can be explained. Okay, so first of all, he gives us this definition of time travel to start off. His definition is this: time travel is simply a difference or a discrepancy between two different measurements of time. Okay? Okay, so at various points in this lecture, I'm going to try and help you to understand by adding some little diagrams and drawings. So the definition you see is that time travel is a discrepancy between two different measurements of time. And let me illustrate that by this. So suppose here's a person, right? There they are. And they have a watch on their wrist, like I do, okay? And on that wristwatch, it says, it says 12 p.m., okay? So it's noon. It's noon for them. Now they're going to step inside. At that point in time, they're going to step inside of this cylinder type thing. Okay? Now they're in there. Now I want you to imagine that they stand inside of this thing, and on their watch it says there's 1 hour of time that has passed. So they're in there for an hour of time relative to themselves. Okay? Now they come out. Okay, now, on their watch, when they come out, it says 1 p.m. on their wristwatch. So, you know, on their watch it says 1 p.m. once on the wrist. But if this is a time traveler, okay, should all the watches outside on the external clocks and on everyone else's wrist, should they also say 1 p.m.? If this guy gets out after spending an hour in the cylinder, his watch says 1, and also everyone else's does too, on the same date, then did he travel through time or no? That's a question. Does this drawing show a time traveler or does it not? So you see the features of the drawing. He gets in, it says 12. He's in there, it's an hour. He gets out, it's 1 p.m. And then he looks at all the clocks everywhere and they say 1 p.m. Now that's not time travel, good. If that's what he did, then this is not a time machine. It's just a shipping container, and he stood in it for an hour, and then he got out, and it's an hour later. Is that time travel? Well, it's not the time travel that we talk about in science fiction and philosophy. That's if you want to call that time travel, it's a very boring kind of time travel. If that's the case, then all of us are traveling through time at a steady, solid rate of 1 hour per hour. Like me and you have just traveled through 13 minutes, 14 minutes of time since this meeting started at 5:30. But that's not what people mean when they say time travel, right? They talk about you zoom ahead in time or you go back. So let's get to that. Suppose that this guy did actually travel 5 hours ahead in time, okay? So when he gets out, on his watch, it says it's 1. But if this is a time traveler jumping ahead 5 hours, then what should all the external clocks say once he gets out of the machine? On his watch, it does say 1. But he's zoomed up 5 hours into the future. So what are the clocks going to say everywhere else? Right. I was thinking, my question is in a way ambiguous. Is it 5 hours after 12 or is it 5 hours after the 1 hour that he spends? But let's just say it's 6 p.m. on all these other clocks, okay? So like 6 p.m. is what is shown on everyone else's cell phone. And you know, if you open your laptop or something, that's the time that's shown on everyone's computer, and it's the time that's shown on like the bottom of the news ticker when you turn on CNN. And so there's a discrepancy, right? On his watch, it looks like it's 1 p.m. that day. But on every other watch and on every other person who's experienced this time, it's 6 p.m. that day. So that's like future time travel. But this is the first possible paradox that the author David Lewis wants to try and justify as not really being impossible. So here's our first possible paradox. Okay. First possible paradox of time travel. How can the same two events be separated by two unequal amounts of time? It seems impossible. Okay, so some would say right here, I'm getting off right here, it's not possible because you can't have two events, the same two events, but they're separated by different amounts of time. So like to make this a little bit clearer for you, think about this in terms of this scenario here. Question, how much time is in between these two events? the man getting in the cylinder and the man getting out of the cylinder? That's the question. How much time is it? Well, it looks like two different answers are both somewhat reasonable. Okay. One answer that seems plausible enough is that it's how much time in between getting in and getting out for this person. He gets in and then he gets out, but how much later is it? He gets out how much later? What's the interval of time between getting in and getting out? What do you think? It's an amount of time, but how much is that amount of time? Well, there's two possible answers, so I know that we're going to say both things, but someone tell me what you think one of those answers could be about how much time it spent or took between getting in and then just emerging from the same machine. Sierra, no. No, you're a little off with that. I've gone to some difficulty to explain with numbers here how much time was spent in one sense and versus another. So one possible way of looking at it is that it took an hour, correct? Okay, let's focus on the Sierra because look, it says here 12 p.m. is on his watch when he gets in, right? And it says here he spends 1 hour inside according to his watch, so that when he gets out, his watch says 1 p.m. That's 1 hour. But to everybody else who's standing outside the machine, to them, it looks like, not the time traveler, but other third parties, they would see it as he gets in at 12, and then he gets out how much later? I'm talking now not about the traveler's perspective on it, but those that are outside the machine looking at the machine. They see him emerge, and only after how long? 6 hours, correct. So what's the answer? Is it 6 hours in between event A and event B? Or is it 1 hour? It seems like both answers make some sense because it's an hour relative to him. Like he spends 60 minutes of his own time in there. But, you know, from the perspective of all other observers, he got in there, they're waiting. Finally at 6 p.m. and he gets out and his watch says 1. And he's like, wow, that was a crazy hour I spent in the cylinder. And they're like, what? You were in there 6 hours. So time is different according to the two reference frames. Now that seems to some people to be a paradox. And I can understand why a person would think of this as a paradox because it sounds crazy to give two answers for one question about how much time something took. Like what if somebody asked you after you took a flight, probably you're not going to be flying too much during the pandemic, but suppose that someone flew and they took just a trip from, I don't know, New York to LAX. So from JFK airport to LAX. You ask them when they land, how was the flight? How long was the flight? And they say, oh, how long was the flight? Well, the flight was 5 hours. Also, the flight was 2 hours. So that's your answer. You'd look at them like, huh, are you losing it? Like, I asked you how long was the flight, and you told me two different numbers. And you'd think that's impossible. I mean, the amount of time it takes can only be one amount. It can't be both 5 hours, but also, on the other hand, it was 2 instead of 5. But that's what this seems like. Asking, how long was it in between getting in and getting out of the machine? One answer seems like it's an hour, the other is 6. Okay, so how is Lewis going to try and show that this is not really so impossible as it seems? Well, he says the way of getting around this difficulty is by referring to two different types of time. Okay, so that's the way to solve the problem. Two types of time. Okay, so on the one hand, there's personal time. And then on the other hand, there's external time. Okay, so personal time definition is this. It's time as it is experienced and measured by the time traveler themselves, as would be shown and recorded on their personal wristwatch. Okay, so measured and experienced, let me give a little extra room. Measured and experienced by the individual time traveler. Yeah. So that's why as shown on their personal wristwatch that they carry with them, that moves with them on their body. Okay, so that is personal time. But external time is something a little different. And here's what that is. External time is time as it is experienced and measured by all external observers and clocks. Okay, so By all external observers and clocks. Okay, two definitions are written there of personal and external time. So personal time would be the time that is measured and experienced by the individual time traveler, and it would be the same kind of time that is passing as shown on their watch, which they keep on their wrist. External time, though, is the time measured and experienced by all the other external observers, aside from the one time traveler. So now we actually get to answer this question: how much time is in between departure and arrival? Well, there's sort of two answers in a way. And who can tell me what those answers are? So it takes 1 hour of what kind of time for this person to get in and out of the machine? Getting in and getting out is separated by 1 hour of which kind of time? Of personal time, correct. But getting in and then emerging from the machine takes 6 hours according to external time. Okay, now, these two are different numbers. They're different amounts of time, but that's not at all problematic because, okay, according to Einstein's theory of space-time, each one of us actually does occupy our own personal time, but for all of us, our personal time and external time largely just coincide because we are not time travelers exposed to the kind of forces or velocities that would cause a significant differential between your measurement and experience of time and that of all others. But, I mean, look, if we could go like close to the speed of light, then there would be big disparities between one person's personal time and then which is measured by all of the people, right? If you're going through space really fast and other people remained at rest, then your personal time would be passing at a much slower rate relative to other people. So like 1 5-minute interval for you could be like 5 months for others if you were going that much faster than they were. So the space-time theory of Einstein actually provides for the way of explaining this paradox away. It only looks like a paradox if you thought that there was only one way that time could pass, or only one frame of reference for time and its measurement. But there can be more than one. And if there was time travel, then that's exactly what it would involve. So in this case, there's more external time than personal time. Suppose that he went, I don't know, 3 hours into the past. So he gets in at 12. On his watch, time's moving forward, and he gets out after 60 minutes according to his watch, and it says 1 p.m. on his watch. But on all the external clocks, it says 10 a.m. So he's gone, you know, minus 2 hours in external time and 1 hour ahead in personal time. So it only looked like a paradox before we were able to introduce the distinction between the two different time frames. But now using that concept, the paradox goes away, and nothing's impossible here. He says this is the way that one could explain puzzling expressions that you might hear in science fiction. So like suppose that someone in a movie of science fiction involving time travel, like, you know, Bill and Ted or whatever. It's a great movie in the genre. But anyway, someone says, hey, in about 15 minutes, I'm going to watch the Beatles perform at Yankee Stadium in 1965. Okay, so that sounds like an impossible statement. It sounds like 15 minutes in the future, I will be 55 years in the past. But now we can explain this correctly by saying, well, it's going to be 15 minutes of personal time, my personal time I'll experience. So in 15 minutes of my own personal experience, I will be minus 55 years in external time. So one paradox explained away. And just as you can hear the author say it, he says this. How could the same two events be separated by two unequal amounts of time? I reply by distinguishing time into external time and personal time. Personal time is roughly that which is measured by the wristwatch. His journey takes an hour of personal time. His wristwatch reads an hour later at arrival, but the arrival is more than an hour after departure in external time if he has traveled toward the future, or the arrival is before the departure in external time if he travels to the past. So yeah, the existence of phrases like, oh, in 15 minutes I'll be with the dinosaurs, can be interpreted as meaning that in 15 minutes of personal time, I'll be far in the past in external time. Okay. So one paradox done. Let's go to the next. Okay, so, and yeah, the reference to Interstellar is fair reference, because in the film they definitely are playing with some of these heady concepts from physics involving different time frames experienced by an interstellar traveler and a person on the Earth. Okay, so next I want you guys to imagine a kind of funny time travel scenario. So imagine that you go back into the past, okay? It's 2020 now, but suppose, you know, next month they drop the first time machine and you get one. So you're like, wow, this is so cool. I'm gonna go back. I wanna go back and talk to myself in 2000, I don't know, 15. You wanna go back to 2015 and tell yourself stuff like what to worry about. Be careful, there'll be a pandemic in 2020. There'll be a guy named, well, you've heard of Donald Trump, he's gonna become the president. I know, can you believe it? But anyway, just get ready and this is what to expect. I don't know. You wanna go back and talk to yourself in the past, when you were younger, okay? So let's say you do it. You step in the machine, step out, it's 2015. I don't know what was happening at that time, you know, music trends, fashion trends, but you're back. You're back in whatever it was for you, middle school. So, well, you're not in middle school. You're the adult 18 or 19-year-old that you are today, but you're in the past year. Now you go and you place, let's say, a phone call to yourself, your younger self. Okay, now I have a question, okay? If you make this call, how many people are on the phone? Is it 2 or is it 1? If a time traveler talks to themselves in the past, is that 2 people on the phone or is it 1? So this is the second possible paradox, because the author says some people would argue that both answers seem plausible. You could argue on the one hand it looks like 2, but there's a reason to say also no, it's actually just 1 person. So good, Carl, you say 1 person, 2 different states. Now there's a term that we've learned about in this part of the class, and so you're very close to using the exact way of the description that would be given in the science or philosophy. 2 different what? These are called 2 different, they're 2 different things, but it's actually 1 person. What are the 2 things, though, that are talking? 2 temporal parts of the same person. Good, Andrea. So one of the temporal parts of the person is the later stage of them, you know, in their whatever age you are now. The other temporal part, the person receiving the phone call on the other end, is the earlier stage of the same individual. But let's go into it. Why do you think that's the best answer? And that's Lewis's answer, that it is 1 person, but it's 2 temporal parts. So why would you say that it's better to say that that's 1 person instead of 2? What reason would you give, if any, to defend, to justify that reaction, that it's actually 1 person, it's not 2 people? Why is it the same person? It is, but what would be the explanation for that? Because, you tell me why. Even if you're just guessing, what would you think would be the reason to say that is actually the same person? People have said 1, except Ronald, I saw you said 2 at first. But to those saying 1, any reason there? You said 2 because each temporal part exists independently in their own universe. I know, this is the same universe because the 2 individual parts are interacting. And if things are in different universes, then they don't occupy the same space. So it wouldn't be proper to say it's different universes. But Andrea, you say because it is 1 individual, just 2 different spots on their timeline that are interacting. Okay, good. Let me try and open that up a little bit more now. When you look at a picture of yourself from a childhood, what makes that also the same person as you? Because look, that's a little kid, and now you're an adult, so they don't look the same. So how come you know that's you? Carl, you say due to the fact that it is 1 person, but they're existing in dependent states in literal time, like Andrea said. Yes, good. But I'm trying to walk you through a little elaboration on the point involving this 1 example. So if you look at an older childhood photo of you, now I'm not talking about time travel, but just pull up a photo from younger days. Now I'm saying, let's say it's a photo of you. Okay, good, AJ, because of your memory. You went right to it, and I was thinking that would take a little longer for someone to say, but that's very good and sharp. It is because you remember being that younger part of your life. You remember, no, that's good. I mean, that's a good thing. So it's like you can remember that point in your earlier existence. Now, when you're looking at a photo of a different human being, like their childhood photos, that's not you in the past. That's not someone who you remember having been in the past. So just in the same way, this time traveler that's gone back to the past remembers being the younger individual who receives the phone call. So there's a linkage of psychological continuity. And that's the reason to say this is the same person, not two different people. Furthermore, the author says, let us use a space-time diagram to show exactly what we're talking about. So I actually want to create a little bigger one. Okay, here we go. Y-axis, x-axis, and then the time dimension running through it. Okay, so now suppose that the person like you is born in 2002. And they're just existing, getting older, and then it's whatever, 2021, next year, time machine comes out, and they say to themselves, oh wow, I need to go back and I want to talk to my younger self from 2015. So you take that trip back to 2015 here, okay? Now, you hang out in 2015 for a minute, you place this phone call to your younger self, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna zoom back to 2021 again. Now this is your timeline. This zigzag streak is your space-time diagram if you were a time traveler going back. Now all of us, the graph that shows our existence, because we don't have the technology or the means to do this, is just a streak that continues on the temporal dimension towards the right until the line ends. But with this zigzag streak, okay, if I was to cut a cross section through the year 2015 like this, like a vertical line through it, how many points of intersection are there on this space-time diagram? This shows you, I hope visually, that at that point, by going back, you've now placed two of the temporal parts of the person in space and time at the same time, right? As you're now moving along through the temporal sequence of temporal parts, you're at this point in your journey along the stages. But you're co-located in space with the 2015 temporal part. So this is the graph that would show you why it's actually the same person, but two stages of the same individual. Now, imagine that you get back to 2021 and you're like, wait a minute, oops, I left something back there. I dropped my phone or something. I need to go back to 2015 and collect it. So you're like, I just gotta make a quick return trip. So here you do it again. And you're like, okay, got it, picked it up, good to go, back in 2021 again. Now you make a second return trip. Because you did that, now how many of your temporal parts are in the year 2015? That would mean that in terms of the graph, you can hopefully see it. It's 3 now, okay? So with each return trip, you would place another one of your temporal parts in that same part of space and time. This movie, Time Crimes, the Chrono Crimenes, is a great film, and they really do mess with this type of scenario because, like, the guy, Hector, is the main character, and something happens to him which pushes him into a time machine, and then he goes back in time and tries to recreate those events, but he ends up messing with his earlier self, and then that causes him to do something that he doesn't want, so he thinks he can fix it, and that means that he makes a second return trip, but it just keeps getting more complicated because all the previous temporal parts are like messing with each other. So anyways, so goes a graph that shows an explanation of where Lewis is coming from. He says, although on one way of looking at it, it looks like two people, because to all appearances, there's one person somewhere calling and another person somewhere hearing the phone call being received. The most natural explanation of it is that that's actually two temporal parts of the same individual, and the psychological continuity between the parts provides for that explanation. Okay, so another paradox set aside, explained away. Yeah, and let's see what he says here. A time traveler who talks to himself on the telephone, this is on page 468, looks to all the world like two different people talking, but it's not quite right to say that the whole of him is in those two places at once, since neither of the two stages involved is the whole thing, or even the whole part of him that is located at the time of the conversation. What's true is that he, unlike us, has two different complete temporal parts located at the same time in different places. Why shall I say that that's one person instead of two? What unites the stages into one person? He says, I answer, that what unites the stages is the same sort of mental continuity that unites anyone else. So the same kind of continuity that exists between you and previous stages of yourself in the timeline of your existence, like memories of yourself being younger, being a child, etc. Okay, so what's the next of these little paradoxes? Well, the third paradox that he mentions, that he's trying to, just push away, is this question of closed loops of causation. Okay, so closed loop of causation. Okay, so something really weird that can occur in a time travel situation would be what is written here, a closed loop of causation. Now, these things would be so strange because if they happened, the existence of the whole loop would be like a total mystery. But each little event within the loop would make sense. Okay, so like here, I'll give you a scenario. This is mentioned in the book, so I'm working with that scenario. But a lot of movies have been written and developed with the same plot line. Okay, so let's say that tonight, or I don't know, tomorrow, you get a phone call from a mysterious caller, okay? But you take the call. So now you're on the phone, and the person says, hey, I need to tell you something very important. I need you to listen to me. And your first reaction is, this is strange, because I feel like I've heard this person's voice before. It sounds like it's my voice, but a little different, maybe a little bit huskier or something. But it does sound strangely almost like me myself. Anyway, you're on the phone. So they're like, yeah, but listen, this is important. Do what I'm telling you. I need you to build something. Just don't worry about what it is or why, but it's crucially important that you do build it, all right? And so you're like, all right, I'll listen to you. Tell me what it is or tell me how to do it. So they give you these detailed instructions, a total blueprint on how to build some type of thing. And you're like, all right, I guess. So you hear the person, you don't know who they are calling you, but they told you how to build something and you did follow the directions. Now you built this thing and you have a weird machine, but you don't know really what to do with it. So you just leave it in your garage and it's there for like 10 years collecting dust. Finally, though, it's 2030, and now you go in the garage, and you blow the dust and the cobwebs and stuff off this thing, and you're like, you know what? I need to turn this on. I've had it here forever. I got that weird phone call back in 2020, and I never really did anything with this so-called machine that the person told me to build, so I'm going to turn it on. You turn it on, and you start to quickly realize, okay, it's a time machine, right? So you get in it. I'm taking this story another step further. You get in that machine. You set the dial to take you to 2020. Okay, follow the steps. Now you're going back to 2020 again. And you're doing this because you have a goal in mind. You want to go to 2020 with the machine so that you can do what back then? What do you think would be the next point in this little plot? I know you've watched a lot of movies. Well, AJ, you might have to rewrite that one. A little typo, I believe. Yeah, so you're going back to 2020 because you want to deliver this message to your younger self. You know, you remember getting the phone call when you were that age. And so you're like, this machine won't be built unless my younger self gets a phone call. And now I kind of recognize that I'm the one who made the call. So you go back to 2020, you make the call, you send off the message to your younger self, and then you go back to 2030 again. Okay, now, this is a weird little loop, because ask yourself, where did the information come from about how to build a machine? Very strange, because, okay, like, well, originally you remember getting the instructions on the phone from some person. So you get the information from a phone call. That's not too strange, I guess. It's just a phone call that you hear. But why do you make the phone call? You make the phone call to provide the information that you remember having received back when you were at that age. So you're delivering information that you've received from your future self. And you preserve the information through memory until it's time for you to deliver it to your past self. But if you ask, where is this information generated from? It seems like it's coming out of the ether. It's just out of nowhere. It's like somehow it's caught in the loop and there's no ultimate origin of that. Now, to me, I believe this is one area of Lewis's article where maybe he didn't give the most robust pushback. You know, he tries to say this is not really a paradox, but I find that at least in this one case, his explanation for why it's not such a paradox is not, to me, the most plausible or convincing. But here's what he says. He says these closed loops of causation, they're very weird, but they're not any more or less weird than other things that we already know are true about reality. So there's inexplicable, bizarre things about reality that are just as strange as this loop. So don't tell me the loop is impossible, because there's other things about the universe that are already that strange. So, for example, take the universe's origin. Has it always been there? Or did it start to exist at a certain point in time? Okay, it's got to be one or the other. Either it's always been there or it hasn't. But whichever answer you give, it's kind of like boggling to the mind. I mean, if it started at some point, what, it started out of literally nothing? How could that happen? If there's nothing, then there's nothing to start anything either. On the other hand, if it's been there forever, how does that make sense? Everything has a beginning, so how can something exist and never even had a beginning of starting? But we know that one of those two things is in fact true, because here is the universe and we're in it. So if that's something that we know is a case and it's bizarre and inexplainable, then maybe these loops aren't so much different than that and they're just the same. So, or if you just want to say, well, God creates the universe, that is why it's not so strange and mysterious that it exists. The same questions then are going to be repeated about God. Okay, so God just exists and there's no ultimate explanation for that. That's just as much a mystery and hard to understand as saying that the universe is like that. So he says that here. He says, recall the time traveler that talked to themselves. He talked to himself about time travel, and in the conversation, the older self told the younger self how to build a time machine. That information was not available any other way. The older self knew how because the younger self was told, and the information was preserved in their memory. The younger self knew after the conversation because the older self told them. But where did the information come from in the first place? Why did the whole thing happen? There's simply no answer. The parts of the loop can be explained, but the whole loop cannot. Strange, but now he says not impossible, and not much different from other inexplicable things that we're already used to. Almost everyone agrees that God or the Big Bang or an infinite past of the universe is uncaused and is not explainable. So if those things are possible, then why would these causal loops be any different? Okay, so I mean, in a way he's trying to say, okay, I concede the point, it is very strange and bizarre, but other stuff is too, so it's not any worse than that. That's basically his reaction to that one. Okay, and then so there's this one last so-called paradox of time travel, and this is the most important one that's saved for the end. So it's about whether or not a person could actually do something that would change the past if they went to the past. And to explore that possibility, a hypothetical scenario is given by the author. It's the case of the grandfather paradox. Okay. Okay, so the grandfather paradox involves a character named Tim. I don't know if Tim, I've always wondered this as I teach this article. Did David Lewis give the person the name Tim because it sounds like time and it's like a pun, time Tim? Anyway, it's Tim, Timothy. So here's the situation of Tim. He inherited a bunch of money from his grandfather. His grandfather was a wealthy industrialist. He made a bunch of money, and for whatever reason, he decided, I'm leaving this with my grandson, Tim, and he's going to inherit it. So Tim has a bunch of money. He's rich. He got it from his deceased grandfather. But there's a funny thing about Tim. He hates his grandfather. I don't really know exactly why, but he has a passionate, just a burning hatred for this man, his own grandfather. And, you know, the grandfather's already dead, so you think he could just let it go. But Tim's an interesting person, and he just doesn't want to let it go. He hates the grandfather so much that he actually wants to do this. He wants to kill the grandfather. But isn't it too late? He's already gone. Well, Tim is persistent. So what he's going to do now is this. All the money that he got from the grandfather that he has inherited, he's now going to take that money and use it to build and develop a time machine. So he gets the research and development, he gets it all done, and now he's actually got a machine that can travel through time, using the money his grandfather left to him. So he built the machine. And now he's getting in there, and he's going to go way back in time to like 1920, okay? And why? He wants to go back to 1920 to kill his grandfather, to be the cause of his grandfather's death. He didn't want his grandfather to live on into his old age and die of natural causes like he actually did. He wants to take him out way back in his prime. He wants to murder his grandfather. So he goes back to 1920 when his grandfather was in his own prime, and he's trying to kill him, okay? So he's trained. He's like an expert marksman. He's got a high-powered rifle, and he's got the element of surprise. He knows exactly where the grandfather will be and at what time. So, all right, he's back in 1920 on this mission to kill the grandfather. But let me just add some further details. The grandfather, who is Tim's grandfather, he conceived the parent of Tim later in time, at like 50. So If the grandfather is killed in 1920, then that will eliminate the sequence of events that leads to the birth of Tim himself, okay? So I just have a straight question for you. In this situation I'm describing, can Tim kill his grandfather or not? Can he do it or can he not do it? That's it. Can Tim kill his grandfather? Can he succeed in his goal or will he not be able to? Okay, Sierra, you're saying no. Gary also saying no. Good. Cameron saying the same, can't succeed. All right, so let's go into that since that's the first reaction I'm getting from many of you. Why do you say he can't succeed? What's the explanation of this? Since you say he can't, why not? Yeah, so if the grandfather, good, Ronald, because it would contradict the timeline. It would mean that the conception of Tim's parent never happened, which would mean that Tim was never born, but yet Tim is the assassin. That does not make sense. He has to be born in order to emerge in the past with the ability to kill the grandfather. So one way of looking at this is that no, there's no way he can actually succeed in this. But okay, Lewis says that to some people who hear about such a situation, they have a different response. Some people say, I don't know, maybe he could do it because he's there. Just because he's there and he has the weapon, I mean, what's to stop him, right? It seems like if he has the means and the motivation to do it, nothing can really get in his way, and he should be able to. So Lewis says this to some is a paradox. On the one hand, it seems like he cannot. On the other, it seems like, why not? He could. So how does Lewis resolve the apparent contradiction? Well, here's what he says. He sides with the intuition that most of you did give, which is that no, he actually won't be able to succeed. But when he fails, as he's inevitably, determined to fail, well, he's not determined in the sense that he wants to fail, but like the conditions are such that they determine that he will fail. When he fails, inevitably, Lewis says it's going to be for some normal reason. It's not going to be like the gun just turns into dust and just, it evaporates, or all of a sudden like a guardian angel swoops in between the bullet, or like the bullet just turns into a frog or something, the gun becomes a toy gun. No, it's just going to be for some ordinary, normal reason. Like at the last moment, the gun will jam, or he'll misfire, or at the last second, the grandfather will pick down, reach up to grab a newspaper, and the bullet will fly right over his head, and then Tim will get a feeling of regret and mercy, and he'll decide not to do it. But whatever ends up happening, we already know how the story ends because we kind of have the benefit of hindsight. In the end, the grandfather survives whatever assassination attempts might have happened in the year 1920, because as things happen, he ends up siring the parent of, Tim. And since Tim has been born, and since he's traveling to the past anyway, whatever causes his birth cannot be prevented. I mean, think about it. Try to make it a little more relevant to yourself. You've been born. There you are watching a philosophy lecture in the year 2020, and you exist. So you exist, right? There's nothing that can be done in this universe to cancel your birth. I mean, you could die at this point, but you can't never have been born. It's too late for that. Your birth happened. And so time travelers going back to the events surrounding your birth would never be able to annul what has already happened. You've already been born. So when Tim goes back, he's basically going to witness the playing out of his failed assassination attempt by whatever means it did fail. Yeah, it's kind of, it does draw on a lot of themes that you see in some of those Marvel comic book universe films. So the last thing I want to say, let me read it here from the Tim scenario. Lewis tries to give voice to both intuitions. So he speaks as the one who says he can do it, and then after that he speaks as the one that says no, he can't. So in the voice of the one who says he can, he writes, Tim can kill the grandfather. He has what it takes. The conditions are perfect in every way. The best rifle money could buy. The grandfather is an easy target. He's only 20 yards away. There's no breeze. Tim has the door locked so no one can get in his room. He's a good shot. He's at the peak of training. So what's to stop him? The forces of logic can't stop him. So it seems like he should be able to kill the grandfather just as much as anyone could ever do that. But then in the next paragraph, he goes into the opposite conclusion. No, Tim can't kill the grandfather. The grandfather lived. So to kill him would be to change the past. But the events of the past cannot be changed. Either the events of 1920 always included Tim killing the grandfather, or else they always didn't. You may be tempted to speak of the original 1920 and the new 1920, but if you do that, you're giving two names to the same thing. There's just 1 year of 1920, and all the events included within it either did or did not include the assassination of the grandfather. And given that he wasn't killed and Tim was born, it doesn't include those events. So he says, you know how the story must go if it's going to remain consistent. Somehow he will fail. Since Tim did not kill the grandfather in the original 1920, consistency requires that he will not kill him either in this so-called new 1920. Why not? Maybe some normal reason. Perhaps a noise distracts him at the last moment. Perhaps he misses despite all his practice. Perhaps his nerve gives out. Perhaps he all of a sudden feels mercy out of nowhere. So these would be the kind of basic reasons why he would fail. Now, I want to finish with just one last point from that essay. And this last point, I find, is where, to me anyway, the whole metaphysical discussion of time and time travel becomes a little more relevant and interesting to your lives. Because a student studying philosophy and then learning about the paradoxes of time travel, the work of Einstein, Ted Sider, you know, a person I could forgive you for thinking, well, this is pretty far out. I mean, none of this could ever happen. It has nothing to do with me. But look, if you're a deep thinker and you really want to consider what this means, it does mean something really crazy. Because if the space-time theory is true, it's not just Tim that's not able to change the past. It's also me and you that are not able to change anything, including the past, present, and future. Okay, so if the space-time theory is correct, then just in the same way that Tim can't alter an event, all the events already exist in space-time. And if that's the case, then nothing that you're doing now could have possibly been done in a different way. Okay, so to explain this point, David Lewis says, let's consider two different senses of the word can. Okay, two senses of the word can. Okay, so one is the narrow sense. And one is the broad sense. Okay, so the narrow sense of the word can refers to what a person can do given a narrower set of facts about them and about the world. So what one is able to do given a narrower set of facts. Contrasting that with the broad sense of the word can, and this refers to what one is able to do given a broader set of facts. Okay, so to give you a better understanding of those concepts, I'm going to ask you a question that is it's a deceptively simple question, but don't overthink it much. Just give me your most common sense answer. Then I'll make it a little more complicated after that. I'm just asking you this, straight up. Hey, can you speak Russian? That's it. Tell me what you can or can't do. Can you? Can you speak Russian? Yes or no? Okay, Ronald, you're saying no. Da? Is this the word for yes or something in Russian, AJ? Or is that just a typo? Anyway, yeah. So everyone's saying no. Well, hold that thought, Gary. We'll get to your depends. Basically, I know that I'm teaching at an American university, and it's just not a common second language that most of us know here. So to those saying that you can't speak Russian, what you mean is that given your current ability and what you've learned and what courses you've taken and what you've studied, you can't do it right now. Haha, funny, Ronald. Okay, but let me ask you this question slightly differently now and see if I'll get a different answer. Okay, if I was to compare you to, I don't know, like one of my cats, compared to that cat, can you speak Russian? Like, cat versus you, can you speak Russian as opposed to the cat? Now you're saying yes. Okay, so what's going on, guys? You give me different inconsistent answers. One time I ask you, can you speak Russian? Saying no. Then I ask the question slightly differently, and you're like, well, in that sense, yes, actually, I can. Okay, so now back to this. In what sense of the word can would you say that you can speak Russian? It's in one of these two senses. So let's try and understand which of the two it is. You can, but only in which of those two senses? When we look at what facts, we would say you can. Given what facts? Yes, in the broad, big picture sense, you can, right? So, for example, the fact that you have a human brain and therefore the intellectual capacity to master a second or third language, and given that you also have the kind of larynx and esophagus and vocal cords that can be used to produce these speech acts, you can, like, it's within the realm of possibility. If you wanted to today to embark on a serious course of study, I believe that you could, at the end of that course of study, be a fluent Russian speaker. So it's something that you could do, but only in that broad sense. When we just zero in on the fact that right now, as of today, you haven't studied it yet, that's when we would say that no, you can't. So when we just like focus on a more restrictive set of facts about you, like the fact that you've not studied it and it's not something you've been exposed to, then we would say no, you can't. But when we open up the factors and we consider, well, you're a human being, you have a human brain and a human speech and phonetic disposition in your body, well, in that larger sense, comparing you to a cat or dog, yeah, you could. Okay, so now Lewis says that the ambiguity here in the sense of the word can is kind of what is at play when we ask that question about Tim. Can he kill his grandfather? Okay, well, if we look at the big picture, no. Like, given the fact that he's born and that the death of his grandfather at that time would contradict the fact of his birth, looking at that big view of the overall timeline, we can see that he won't be able to. But if you just zero in and narrow your focus to the fact that he's got a gun pointed and he's in a place where he wants to kill somebody and he has a motivation to do it, that's when it looks like he can. So now I'm bringing it a little bit back home to like relatability to us. If this whole space-time theory is correct, I want to ask you a question then, and it's kind of parallel to the question about Tim. You're watching the lecture right now, so that's what you're doing. Could you have not watched this lecture tonight? Could you have chosen to not watch it? Some of you guys are watching it on delay later. So could you have not sat down and watched this lecture right now? You're saying yes. Okay. In what sense? Because there's another sense in which no, you couldn't have. Okay, so tell me about that. In what sense, if the space-time theory is true, is it impossible that you didn't watch this today? If the space-time theory is true, you really couldn't have not watched this. You say you could not have watched it, but that's not true according to one way of looking at the universe. So given what facts would a person say, no, you could not have possibly avoided this? This is your destiny to watch this right now. In what sense of the word can would we say that there's no way for you to do anything differently than what you're now doing? If the space-time theory is true, then on what basis would I say to you, you could not have avoided watching this? Well, it's in the, no, it's not the narrow sense this time. In the big, broad, big picture sense, Tim could not prevent the survival of his grandfather from happening, or he could not affect the assassination. So in the big, broad scheme of things, if the space-time theory is correct, then every event that ever happens in the whole universe, past, present, and future, is all fully set and is all fully real right now. So if that is true, then there's nothing that you can do differently than the things that you actually do. Counterfactual things, like things that are contrary to fact, don't exist. Only the actual outcomes and events in your actual timeline do exist. And there's nothing you can do to prove otherwise, right? So like if I want to show that I have free will by doing something that wasn't supposed to happen, how can I prove it? Here's a marker. Will I take the marker cap off? I'm telling you that I will. No, I won't. Yet, wait. No, I won't. Was that free will? Was there a counterfactual case where I did take the cap off and so what I just showed you is that I was dancing between two possible outcomes and I just chose one of my free will? Well, there's no way that you can demonstrate that the counterfactual possibility is something real. And this is where I find it interesting as a philosopher. You know, when I teach students about contingent and necessary truths, and I tell people stuff like, well, a contingent truth is something that could have happened differently. You know, like the Lakers won the championship, but the Miami Heat maybe could have won the championship if the games were played a little differently or whatever. And sometimes people hear about that and they're thinking, possibility talk? That's just so weird and that's so unrealistic. I mean, all I saw was that the Lakers won. I don't know if it could have happened differently. But now when I tell you that there's nothing you can do except for the actual events of your life, you're going to become the philosopher. Like, oh, well, there's possibilities on possibilities. I could do anything. I could, drop out of school. I could watch a lecture. I could not watch it. I could, go on a run, or I could just sit at home and watch Netflix. But all the possibilities that you're thinking of are just in your head. The only actual events that happen are the the real events. So the space-time theory is very deep, and it's very, very revealing of our condition as human beings. If it is true, it really does tear away at the notion of having an open future and the ability to act freely. There will be the illusion of free will, like I just demonstrated, like feeling like, oh, I have these choices and which one will I take? But the outcome itself is predetermined according to the space-time theory. So how weird and interesting is that? The idea of predestination and fate is like a real concept according to this physical theory, which is the consensus view of science. And that, I think, is also one part of intellectual life where you can sort of see religion and science converging on one common theme. In religion, they say that God is the creator of everything and that he has a plan for everybody in every event. So he's omniscient, right? As we started the class by saying, if God exists and he is omniscient, then nothing would surprise him, and he knows everything that will happen and that ever has happened. So like all the events of your entire future are known by God if God does exist. So that's kind of like the idea of predestination and fate, and that you would have to hope for God's providence because ultimately it's all in his hands, right? Now, if you're not a theist and you're more in favor of science, then you could embrace the space-time theory of Einstein and reach a similar conclusion. The laws of nature and the nature of space-time governs all the events that will ever happen. So I just kind of have to hope for the providence of the universe to play out in my favor, but I'm not actually the one who takes actions that control the nature of what does occur. So heady thoughts, right? Predestination and fate. There's a sort of common ground that could be discovered between a scientific or a religious perspective. But okay, some people still believe in the existence of free will despite these ideas of Einstein. That's something I'm interested in. How can we come up with an idea of freedom, of free will, that is compatible with these theoretical results of science? I've written a little bit on that. I have my own views on that. There's a lot of other people who've talked about it too, the debate between free will and determinism. I believe that we do have free will, but I don't think that that means that we can just do anything. I think that we actually are determined to act the way that we do, but freedom, I believe, consists more in knowing why you're doing what you're doing. So I think it has a little bit more of a epistemological basis. You're free when you're not like a leaf blowing in the wind, like, why is this happening? But you're doing things intentionally and you know the reasons why. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have the power to act counterfactually, but it does give you a greater dignity than, inanimate objects, which just do whatever they do based on pure physics, and they don't have a mind that can reflect on the behaviors that, they physically do. Okay, so we've come close to the, this is the end of the David Lewis and the time subject of our class. So I want to just take the last 10 minutes of the meeting to preview the next subject that we're going to jump into starting next week. And we'll do our best next week to cover as much of it as we can before we head into our Thanksgiving holiday. But the next topic that's on the schedule is called philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind is another major subject area of philosophy. So we've covered a lot of the others so far: philosophy of religion, ethics, epistemology, metaphysics of time. Now we look at the philosophy of mind. And this area is all about consciousness. Consciousness, thought, perception, experience. Right now I want you to form an image in your mind of your mom or something. Well, you're able to think. You're able to have like mental imagery. You're able to use memory. You're able to imagine, dream, hope, fear, feel pain, pleasure. So you have an internal mental life, okay? But not everything in this world does. I'm holding a marker and it doesn't have any of that. It's just an inanimate object. I mean, I can use it to write on the board, but there's nothing it's like to be the marker. It doesn't feel, it doesn't see, it doesn't perceive, it doesn't have the five senses, it doesn't have thought, experience, pleasure, or pain, but we do, okay? So consciousness is a very, very fascinating thing. Imagine the universe that we're living in if life never developed. It'd just be a bunch of matter you know, but it wouldn't be the most interesting. I mean, it'd be interesting, I guess, but no one would be interested in it. It'd just be a bunch of stuff operating according to physical laws, but there'd be nothing thinking, nothing feeling, nothing experiencing. But then there's us, and we do have that. So it's one of the most fascinating things that consciousness exists. And philosophers are interested in it. They want to probe into the nature of it. What is consciousness? What is its fundamental basis? How does it exist? Is it just physical? Is it just the brain? Or is there something spiritual about it? Is there like a soul? Is there like a ghost in this physical machine? Or is it just flesh and blood, bones, neurons, cells, and that's the end of it? So these are debates, and we're going to consider both sides of that debate. Some of the big questions in the philosophy of mind, now I can list them. Are the mind and the brain two different things, or are they the same thing? People take different positions on that. Some people think the mind just is the brain. There's nothing separate from the brain when it comes to consciousness. That's what people who are called physicalists believe. That everything's physical. Consciousness is just a physical process playing out. But other people say, no, the mind and the brain are different. The brain is, you know, it's in your skull, and it's definitely has something to do with cognitive activity. But to those that are called dualists in the philosophy of mind, they say the mind is something that's separate entirely from the body. The mind could even survive the destruction and the annihilation of the body. So like your soul could survive your mortal destruction and could even go to heaven or reside in some other realm of existence. But some people believe that the mind and consciousness does not necessarily need to have a physical basis. So that's a debate, and we're going to look at both of those positions. Sort of related to that, could consciousness be explained physically or not? Could it be explained physically? Some people say consciousness, if you boil it down, it's really just neurons and synapses firing. It's all neurochemistry. Obviously, if you take on a significant head injury, that's going to have changes to your cognitive abilities. And you know, if you're taking certain drugs, right, chemicals placed in certain neurotransmitters and dopamine receptors in your brain can alter your experience consciousness. So some people think that that shows that there's just a physical structure here, and that in the end it is just a physical thing. But some people say no, consciousness is it's subjective. It's so rich, it's so complex that there's no way that it could be reduced to a purely physical process of just nerves and cells operating in conjunction. So that's another debate. And then another one that we'll also touch on next week is this: could a machine ever think or have consciousness? Okay, so like this is an interesting question. That's really, it's a question for current day philosophers and scientists. This is a question that had no footing before, you know, the 20th century. People were not sitting back in the year, you know, 1200 saying, can a computer ever actually have a mind? Because the idea of these machines that could even come close to simulating conscious behavior or consciousness didn't exist. But now we do have artificial intelligence. We have very intelligent chatbots and AI systems that can, to a high degree of similarity, imitate the behavior of conscious beings, right? You can talk to some of these chatbots that AI labs develop that are designed to fool you into thinking they're real people. And we've got AI systems now that can write songs, that can write even scripts. I invite anybody who wants to follow up on this topic to go out and find the chatbot named Mitsuku, because that's the most advanced chatbot in the world. It's won the Loebner Prize for like the past 3 or 4 years, which is like a big international award that's given to the best, most realistic human-like chatbot on the market. So it's very strange talking to her, just because of how subtle and sophisticated the program keeps getting better. Anyway, some people think, yeah, well, machines will someday have consciousness like we do. You know, if we build the most powerful computer, it's like there's going to be some kind of light on inside, as it were, some consciousness, some actual thought. But other people say, no way, that can't happen. No matter how much it closely imitates the behavior of a conscious being, it's never actually feeling or thinking anything. It's just, it's operating according to programming. So when an input is given to it, a certain output is elicited. But there's nothing going on inside, like it's feeling hope, fear, pain, even if it attests to those things in some written or spoken form. So some people believe that machines are just black boxes that produce observable behavior that may appear on the outside to be consciousness, but that it's not real bona fide consciousness, that you'd actually have to be a biological life form like us to even have that. So we'll see that debate as well. We'll take a look at the writing of Alan Turing, who's actually the famous creator of the digital computer. There was a movie made about it not too long ago, and Benedict Cumberbatch won the Oscar for his portrayal of Alan Turing, and the movie was called The Imitation Game. So maybe some of you have ever heard of it, but that movie doesn't focus as much on his computer programming experience, but rather his work as a code breaker for the Allies when we were trying to defeat the Nazis in World War II. We actually owe a lot of gratitude to Mr. Turing, not just for helping us develop the digital computer with all of the impressive applications that has had since 1950, but helping to win the war, World War II, against fascism. Anyway, so he made this paper in 1950 called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And way back in 1950, I mean, imagine that 70 years ago, here's the creator of the computer, and he's basically laying out an argument that machines will someday be thinking and have consciousness. And that's a pretty visionary argument to be making in 1950, because computers then, I mean, they sort of existed, but they would be like the size of a garage, and they'd have less processing power and computing power than a modern day pocket calculator. But nonetheless, you have to start somewhere. And even from that position, he, looking into the future, was judging that there's no limitation to how much processing power and data speed that these computers will eventually have. And he thought that that was the only obstacle, just technological limitations, not like a conceptual impossibility to have thinking machines. But that's just one person's view, and we'll compare that against objections from those that say machines could never think. Okay, so as we return on Tuesday, we're going to talk about two main positions in the philosophy of mind, and then we're going to start developing those. Some people are what are called monists, and some people are what are called dualists. Monists believe that the whole universe and everything in it is just made out of one kind of thing. And for example, that everything's just made out of atoms, just made out of physical matter. That's one type of monism. That's called physicalism. Other people are called dualists, and they hold instead that there are two substances that make everything up. And so what dualists believe is that it's not just all made out of matter, but that there's matter and there's mind. And mind, according to a dualist, is not the brain, but it's rather like the soul. It's something that's not physical. It's not got mass, shape, volume, or size. It's got no weight. It's literally not extended in space, but it's like a pure consciousness, like a disembodied consciousness. So dualists believe that there's that. There's like this immaterial, incorporeal mind. And then there's also atoms that form bodies and that form mass and that form objects. So we're going to look at a debate between monism and dualism, between physicalism and dualism. And we'll get started with the writing of Rene Descartes, and he makes an argument for dualism. So just a slight bit behind because I wanted to get more into it today, but this is okay. We're going to continue on the same themes next week. Now moving into the philosophy of mind, studying Descartes, and then after him, some physicalists. So we'll get both sides of the argument as usual. But all right, guys. Thanks again for everything, for attending, and for making the lecture fun and interesting. For now, then, I'll see you guys next time. I'll be in touch if anyone wants or needs anything over the weekend. But for now, yeah, have a good one, and stay safe and everything. I know a lot of people are getting sick out there, unfortunately, but I'm sure you'll be all right as long as you just take the proper steps. So I'll see you guys next time then. All right, bye-bye.